On this episode of the SurgeonMasters mini podcast, I have with me cardiothoracic anesthesiologist, trained executive coach, podcast host and writer, Dr. Zeest Khan. Dr. Khan's had an experience with long COVID and is now an advocate for patients with long COVID. Welcome, Zeest.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
Tell us a little bit more about your background and add to what I've done in our introduction.
Sure. I am a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist in Northern California. My practice was pretty broad, though. Took care of bread and butter pediatric patients all the way up to really complex cardiac work and trauma. And in 2020, I fell ill. I live and work and serve a population that is rural/suburban, and we were hit pretty hard by the COVID-19 virus. In 2020, my health deteriorated and I ended up not being able to work. I could barely breathe well. I could barely walk. And I was ultimately diagnosed with long COVID. I've spent the past few years focused on my recovery. I have made some tremendous progress, and I'm now pivoting my career to help others with complex illness safely navigate healthcare and hopefully find some recovery like I have.
Fantastic. And you also shared with me a little bit of a message that you felt would be very useful and helpful with our audience, with surgeons wanting to improve their life. Talked about it a little bit in the aspects of kind of dealing with crisis. And it sounds like you have a tremendous background even before, but you've also had some challenges or crises that you've had to deal with.
You know, we deal with crises in medicine, my field in particular, your field in particular, and we train to learn the skills that are going to get us through a very scary and very dangerous situation. We're not just on a salvage mission. We are trying to optimize a good outcome for our patient. And we learn those skills professionally, but we certainly have crises in our life outside of that. I didn't expect to have a medical crisis, but I found that because I was dealing with something that is so poorly understood, I started applying the principles that I learned about crisis management to myself because I couldn't find a physician, especially in those early days, who could help me get better.
And so tell us a little bit about that, what you learned and what we can learn from you.
So I did my anesthesia training at Stanford, which I was lucky enough to learn under Dr. David Gaba, who was one of the pioneers of crisis management, particularly in anesthesiology. He's written quite a bit about it and based a lot of the research on flight safety, on airline safety principles. There were 3 skills or principles that sort of summarize his approach. And I'm taking some liberties with what those principles are and how they were written. But one is use a reliable process. So for anesthesia and in the OR, a lot of times this is a checklist. And the hope is to prevent a crisis by consistently using a reliable process. 2, use reliable procedures, ones that are already established, so you don't reinvent the wheel. And 3, use your team. And I would add, use your resources. And in order to do all of these things, we've got to really realistically assess the situation that we're in, even when it's a dangerous crisis, and recognize the resources that we have and how we can use those resources to optimize our outcomes. In residency, the way we initially learned this was that we were in a simulation lab with our classmates and these prominent attendings, and we're put in simulations of crises, of like dangerous situations. And it was embarrassing and stressful because we would all make kind of similar mistakes. We make the same types of mistakes when we have crises in our personal lives. And I think these principles have really helped me find some direction in how my treatment should go. And ultimately, it helps when you're supporting someone, like in a coaching relationship, supporting a client through a challenge as well. Crises are inevitable, but it really helps to have some guiding principles to help us get through.
Excellent. So tell us a little more.
Well, let's start with the first of the three principles. Use a reliable process. When we're in a stressful situation, our executive functioning fails us oftentimes, but also our senses can fail us. We know from airline safety research and crisis management research in medicine that healthcare workers often don't see resources in front of them. They don't hear for instance, the pulse oximeter alarm. I remember when I was in a simulation for malignant hyperthermia, I had a box. It was called the malignant hyperthermia box. And they said, ready, set, go. And I opened up that box and there was papers in there. And I started throwing the papers and I just wanted to get to the medication, to the dantrolene. It turns out all those papers had the instructions of what to do and how to administer and how to dilute the medication. So we don't even see the things in front of us, which really restricts the way we assess the situation. And so approaching an emergency with a reliable process that you have used before is a really good place to start, particularly when you feel like you're in a situation that you've never been in before, one that is scary and one that is, of course, stress-inducing. I'll give my personal example of how I applied this. When I first fell ill and my symptoms were at their worst, I had neurologic issues. I had pulmonary issues, so I couldn't think straight. I was pre-syncopal. I had significant trouble breathing. My heart rate was all over the place. I didn't know what was going on, and no one could really give me much help. It finally clicked that I'm going to approach my situation the same way I do a complex patient I'm taking care of who is in a dangerous situation themselves. What are the processes that I used there? Well, I took a top-down approach. All of these things are happening to me, and I can list them to you now, but it was really hard for me to list them and tease out all of the issues. So just like I would assess a patient in the pre-op holding area, I'd go top down. What's happening with my neurologic system? What's happening in my airway system? What's happening with my heart, my belly, my muscles? For me, that was even though it was like very similar to the process I used as an anesthesiologist, it was so empowering to be able to categorize and identify the problems I was facing. And you in your life are going to have to take a more personalized approach unless it is a medical issue like I had. But by taking a breath and taking a look at the situation, a big situation becomes more simplified if we can tease out the parts of the problem that are contributing to the whole issue. So that's the first step. Use a reliable process.
And the second one, it sounded like you introduced before, was using reliable procedures.
Yes. There's a tendency in the field that I'm in now of long COVID that is very poorly understood and in many ways a new condition to bet everything on research finding an ultimate cure or an ultimate solution. But that's a big bet, and that's probably going to take a while. There are a lot of patients who are using experimental treatments and medications to alleviate their symptoms. They have theoretical value. I started on the other side. As I've done as an anesthesiologist, I know that it helps to start with known, reliable procedures and treatments that are going to help me. So I wanted to ask, the people I work with and the people listening, what works for you when you're in a difficult situation? You can ask, what is my tendency? What do I typically do? But a better question then is, what works when I do it? Having long COVID is scary and new, but I know that there are some, in my case, simple known medications that can treat the symptoms of my disorder. In life, do you have a method and an approach that has worked for you in the past? We talk about innovating a lot, and innovation has its role in new situations, but it's disorienting enough to be in a crisis. It can be a really helpful starting point to start using the skills and the procedures and the treatments that you know are going to work for you.
That makes sense. And maybe beyond procedures, what was your third principle of crisis management?
So Dr. Gaba talks about using a team. And in crisis management and anesthesia and the operating room specifically, it's very helpful that each person in the room is helping, and number two, helping in a specific way. Each one of us can't do everything. We can do one thing at a time, even though I'm sure you've been in situations where you wish you had two more arms. I certainly have. But we have to realize that we have resources. We don't have unlimited resources. I live in an area that is not very wealthy. We don't have the resources of really large institutions, and yet we're performing safely very complex procedures all the time. I don't have all the money in the world. I don't have access to the most brilliant minds in the world, but I have something. What do you have? What is in your toolbox? Who is on your team? And I invite you to not only assess all of those resources and reflect on the ways they have helped you in the past and the roles they have played in your life in the past, but how can those skills or those strengths translate to this new situation that you're in, into this crisis? I can't really increase what's in my toolbox, but maybe I can use one of those tools in a new way. And that's what I've practiced doing. And it's benefited me tremendously as someone with a disease that very few people understand, if anyone. I use what I can. And if by utilizing those resources maximally, I can then easily identify what else I might need. What else do I need to invest in and add into this toolkit? Because you'd be surprised at how much you have at your fingertips if you start taking a wider view of the resources that you have.
Zeest, that's fantastic. It sounds like your training and your life experiences have taught you a great valuable lesson here. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of summarize the key points for our listeners.
The key takeaway first is to breathe, take a step back. Stress is an inevitable part of our life. Crisis is unavoidable, even with our best attempts. And whenever I was called overhead or paged overhead for an emergency, the first thing I do is take a deep breath and then go in the right direction. Recognize how stress is going to impact your decision-making and try to compensate for that as best you can. And then start with what you know. You are in the position that you're in because you have a set of processes, procedures, and resources that have supported your success and your progression. When you find yourself in a crisis, one that you may not have ever anticipated, rely on the skills and the procedures and the resources that have helped you so far. Start there and then move forward.
Fantastic summary, Zeest. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
There you have it. This is Jeff Smith, along with Zeest Khan, until the next episode of Life Improvement Strategies for the Surgeon Who Wants More. Ciao.